Welcome to 10 Kids, 2 Docs. I'm Dr. Vivian Carlin, and I'm joined by my dear friend and co-host, Dr. Sylvia Bank. Between our two households, we're navigating life with 10 children, so we know how chaotic parenting can be. As Johns Hopkins trained pediatricians, we also know the science. Our goal is to bring you the best of both worlds, medically sound, trustworthy advice, and practical, real-world insights as we dive into the trials and triumphs of parenting. Please note this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment from your doctor. So today we're talking about hot topics in pediatrics. It seems like pediatrics is always in the news these days, which is so exciting. So Sylvia, why don't you start us off? What do you have for us today?
Sure. I think one of the most recently interesting things I've seen in the news is this new, I don't know if you've heard about this, but the first ever gene therapy for treatment of a disease recently was developed and fast-track FDA approved. Have you heard about this?
No, tell me about this.
Sure. So it's a medication called otarmeni. There is a gene out there called the OTOF gene, and people that have a mutation in this gene cannot hear. They don't make a product in the body that's needed for hearing. And this mutation accounts for only 2 to 8% of inherited hearing loss. So we're not talking like everyone that has hearing loss. You know, it's a small percentage of those people. But this gene therapy, what they do is they have this kit where they administer this gene therapy, a single dose surgically into the cochlear area of the ear. Like a lot of people are familiar with the cochlear implant. You know, that is what helps a lot of people who have congenital hearing loss hear. But this kind of introduces that gene therapy into the cochlea of the non-hearing person via a syringe, you know, and a catheter. And then it's connected to this infusion pump. And what it does, it delivers a functional copy of this gene to the inner hair cells of this non-hearing person's ear.
Yeah.
And then what happens is then the cells of the ear start producing that product or that protein that is needed for the auditory signaling and hearing to happen.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Do you know anything about like what ages they can do this at?
So what they know so far is there was a clinical trial of 24 pediatric patients, and these kids ranged from age 6 months to 16 years. And these children had, you know, severe or profound hearing loss. And basically after they administered this gene therapy, of the 20 patients, 80% of them experienced improved hearing, which is not expected in the natural history of this disease without intervention.
Right,
so that's super promising. And it's like extremely exciting, you know, in the field of medicine to administer basically gene therapy to improve someone, right?
Yeah, you've got me just looking that in an adult study, over half of the adults reached normal hearing levels by the end of the study, looking at this gene therapy.
Yeah, it's super
That's
duper
incredible.
exciting. Yeah, and this is the type of thing that, you know, medicine, you know, for us as doctors, this is next level, right? Like this is the kind of stuff that, you know, we read about in science fiction. And it's so promising to think that you can take someone who is destined to be non-hearing and then restore their hearing for the rest of their lives. Like, that's life-changing, right?
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, it actually has me wondering if at some point we'll discover what the gene is in certain animals that allows them to have incredible hearing
right?
as humans, right? Anyway, that's really, I love it. That's fascinating.
Yeah. So keep on the lookout as more and more of these types of therapies develop. I think this was the first, but it will not be the last, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so an article that I came across this past few months really reminded me of our past discussion where we talked about being able to subdivide autism into different neurobiological entities that were found in studying a lot of children and adults with autism. This was a similar thing with ADHD. And the article was published in JAMA Psychiatry in February of 26. And the article name is Mapping ADHD, Heterogeneity, and Biotypes phenotypes by topological deviations in morphometric similarity networks. So sounds super exciting when you just hear the title. But anyway, I've seen this article pop up in, all kinds of mainstream journals, right? People were really excited about this. But basically what researchers did is they took 446 children with ADHD, and then they took hundreds of children that did not have a diagnosis of ADHD. And they did these brain scans on them. They were looking at, like, in different brain regions, how many connections there were, how efficiently that region of the brain communicated with other regions, and how well that bridged different functional communities in the brain together. But the whole point was that in their group of children with ADHD, they were able to then determine that there were 3 distinct patterns of brain mapping in these children. So there was a subtype that had more widespread differences from the normal group, and that group had the highest levels of both inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity. And then there was a second subtype that had alterations in a different part, concentrated in a different part of the brain, part that tends to focus on action control and response. And that group had a predominantly hyperactive, impulsive profile of ADHD. And then there was a third type that had more very focal or localized differences in a different region. And that type tend to have a difference in sustained attention. So what was really interesting about this is that, they found these 3 distinct groups on all of this brain imaging and scanning that they did. And then they took those 3 groups and they compared it to the data they had on how these patients presented. In other words, what their phenotype was, like what was their actual symptoms of ADHD, and it correlated. So very similar to when we discussed the very, very beginnings of trying to delineate the differences between autism and how it presents differently from one child to the next, neurochemically and brain structure and genetically, all of the different factors that are involved. This was starting to break down the differences in ADHD. They actually repeated the study with another set of about 450 children, and they got the same results.
No, this really kind of brings up 2 thoughts, as I practice in pediatrics and treat and care for children with ADHD. Number 1, there is a potential for this type of brain scanning to maybe possibly in the future be diagnostic for ADHD, right? Like currently the way that we diagnose ADHD in the office is either first pass, some behavioral surveys that the parents or teachers do, and we kind of look at the responses and gauge their behavior. Like, does this meet a pattern of ADHD? Obviously, there's more intense neuropsychological testing that can take place that usually doesn't happen in the pediatrician's office, but it's all kind of just based on either behavior scores or what observer looks at in the child at that moment in time, versus if you have some consistent finding on neuroimaging, then one could even say, in the future, part of the workup will be some sort of brain scan to try to make the diagnosis or delineate what type of subtype of ADHD they have. And that's very exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And, just like what we talked about in the previous article with autism, this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is just the beginning. The big thing I want to see eventually us starting to tackle the questions of is, okay, we've proven that there is this distinct neurochemical brain signaling change that we can repeat in groups of kids with ADHD and kids that are not affected by ADHD. And the question is, why? Why is this happening? Why is this increasing? We've certainly seen the diagnosis increase over the past few decades. So why?
Yeah.
That's what I want to know.
And that kind of leads us back to our last recap 10 episodes ago, where we were talking about this with respects to the phenotypes of autism, right? Like after you see that there's a difference in brain scanning, then what is leading to that cause?
I also wonder too, with both of these diagnoses, as we get more sophisticated in our ability to see differences at this neurochemical brain structure level, are we going to be able to make the diagnosis earlier? I don't know. All of these things that I hope the next several decades are going to uncover.
I want to make one other point about this finding as well. The presentation of ADHD can be very variable. Someone who
Absolutely.
is just a little bit absent-minded to, these subtypes where there are these extreme outbursts of defiance and emotion and disruption that can really disrupt the classroom, unroof, a family dynamic at dinner time. And, parents will often feel like, what am I doing wrong? Why is my child with ADHD presenting in this extreme way versus my best friend's child with ADHD doesn't? And I think this variability on neuroimaging showing different subtypes will help people realize that there are variable presentations to ADHD. And the fact that your child is having meltdowns once a week and another child isn't, that might not be on you as a parent, right? There actually may be a different subtype and a different reason why your child is behaving or manifesting their ADHD symptoms in a different way. So I feel like that can be very validating for parents as well. And just like you said in the last episode, that autism may in the future be thought of as an umbrella term, this may be the case for ADHD as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah, super interesting. In the second half, let's turn our attention to social media in the news and the court cases and what's going on with that.
Okay, so Vivian, what other hot topics have you seen in the news recently about pediatrics?
Yeah, so of course, there's been this like landmark social media addiction trial in California, and then also some in New Mexico about, should Meta and social media platforms be held responsible for adolescent anxiety and depression that the adolescent states is due to their exposure and addiction to social media. And it's really fascinating.
Specifically their algorithms, right? The algorithms that these platforms put out in order to create addiction in adolescents, right?
Right. So it's really interesting how it's spurred this like much larger debate among, people on social media who are involved in pediatric care and who aren't involved in pediatric care, and parents and who aren't parents. Like everybody seems to have opinions on this. And it seems the core of the debate is between behavioral addiction experts who argue that the product was designed to be addictive and kind of, drugify, quote unquote, this human interaction, against the defense who argue that, well, youth mental health struggles are profoundly complex and are rooted in changes to society that are rooted in offline life, and that the social media was almost just a escape from these other things in life that have changed in the way that we raise our children that are contributing to depression and anxiety. And so the idea is social media a product that was negligently designed to be addictive, or is it a neutral platform that children turn to as a coping mechanism? So this is the gist of the argument. So tell me your thoughts on that.
Well, I feel like adolescent anxiety and depression existed prior to social media, right? It was something that all pediatricians knew about, even before the pandemic, even before social media was ever a thing. These diagnoses existed prior to that. So, one can't say that social media in of itself is the cause of pediatric or adolescent anxiety and depression. That's pretty clear, right?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Jonathan Haidt, right? We referenced him on one of our shows. He was the one that wrote The Anxious Generation, which came out in 2024. And he makes a pretty strong case. His core thesis is that, social media and the addiction of it is actually causing this rewiring of the adolescent brain and the way the brain is developing that causes psychological harm. And he does say, like, there's multiple things in that. Like, there's a loss of free play, where, in other words, social media it's taking away from opportunity to do other things because you're so engaged to this online. There's the dopamine feedback loop, which we're familiar with, right? Where you're getting these dopamine hits and you're happening to do it at a time of very high brain development, high brain plasticity, and you're getting that brain used to these like rapid fire dopamine hits from the infinite scrolling from social media. Of course, there's a component of social comparison and perfectionism. And is that creating anxiety as far as I don't look as good as this other person does on social media? And then just, is it contributing to sleep deprivation and fragmented attention? Like, are we rewiring those young brains in a way that they can only engage in very short form content like TikTok shorts, or are we also rewiring it in a way that they can't settle down and actually get deep sleep? So he makes a pretty sharp claim where he thinks social media absolutely did have an effect in that time period where we saw such an increase in depression and anxiety. But not everybody agrees with him. I feel like this court case has really brought that out.
Yeah, I would say that I think that these things existed, like the anxious child and the anxious adolescent existed prior to social media. And I will go back and quote something that you said in our social media episodes the beginning of season 2, is that I feel like social media is an amplifier of those problems, right? Like the problems existed before, and putting social media on top of that amplified the problem. For an individual, whether or not that was the rewiring that Jonathan Haidt talks about, and also for a society, like on both levels, I feel like social media has amplified adolescent depression and anxiety, in my opinion, for sure, right?
Yes, yeah, I definitely think that's true. I appreciate you quoting me from what I said. Let me give you the other side. So in reading about this online debate that was going on, I was introduced to an author who was also a New York Times bestseller, whose work I hadn't read yet, and that's Abigail Shrier. And she wrote a book, Bad Therapy, Why Kids Aren't Growing Up, that was a New York Times bestseller in 2024. And she's very skeptical about the debate that social media is addictive and that's what's causing anxiety and depression, because she actually focuses on the behavior of adults as the culprit in what is contributing to adolescent anxiety and depression. So she takes a much different look, but she is widely popular that, this is another example of parents and clinicians trying to find a scapegoat to contribute to this labeling of kids with an abnormal level of anxiety and depression, where, there is, like you said, there's a normal baseline. There's always been anxiety and depression in teens, but there's a normal baseline of it. And some of it is that we are over processing our children's lives. We're, we're looking for blame as to why we're seeing this increase. But part of it may be that we are self-inducing it by the way that we're parenting. So she speaks pretty harshly against gentle parenting as it's like stripping kids of grit. And she speaks also about like when we over worry about the safety of these platforms, we're just buying in again to this culture of safetyism in our parenting, that we're no longer allowing our children to take risks and to go try new things, right? So anyway, she feels like the lawsuits are treating children like passive victims of an algorithm, but the greatest harm we are doing to a child is telling them that they have no agency over their own attention or their own emotions, that this is somehow contributing to this overall kind of loss of agency that children are developing. Now, I will say, for as widely popular as this book is, there is a lot of criticism as well, but it's really interesting to bring up and kind of think about both of these perspectives together.
It reminds me of our season 2 opener where you were quoting that New York Times opinion piece of do you remember that?
Yes, this was why the birth rate is going down.
Yes,
this
millennial
woman, yes, she was speculating.
Yes.
It's because so many people her age have been told that their parents somehow contributed to their mental health problems. That actually also comes up in this book, that therapists have kind of built this culture of let's look back on your childhood and see what went wrong that caused you to have this anxiety and depression. And in some way is like placing blame on parents that then causes people not to have children, right?
Right.
Yes.
Or puts a lot of pressure on parents. Like this is what we talk about. Like, if it's too much pressure, it's too much expectation for a parent to do everything perfectly, or else they're worried that their child is going to be messed up. I think that's just way too much pressure on perfect parenting, right?
Yes, yes. I mean, I think, when I think about this debate, well, and I mean, it's hard as a pediatrician and a parent not to be angry about social media anyway. It's been kind of the bane of our existence, right? In our parenting, to have to monitor our kids' social media and figure out when to give it to them. I wish it just didn't exist. Like, I will fully admit my bias. But I do feel like, we have extensive clinical research that shows that addiction frequently increases both anxiety and depression through this vicious cycle of neurochemical change and lifestyle stress. And you might say, oh, well, if you're addicted to drugs or to alcohol, that's having a brain altering effect. But it goes beyond that because it can also be addiction to behaviors, right? Like gaming or like pornography or like gambling, right? We have good data in these other spheres of addiction that it highly increases the risk of anxiety and depression. And there's multiple ways that happens. So there's the neurotransmitter depletion, right? We talked about that already. Like you get the dopamine hits from scrolling on social media. Then when you're off, you have a deficit that can lead to a depressive crash. There's this stress sensitivity that any addiction can kind of sensitize the brain's stress response. So you kind of all operate with this heightened level of anxiety, and then you sort of need to be scrolling on the social media to bring that down. There's withdrawal symptoms, very similar, like anxiety or depression when you're not on. And then social media in particular, there's the social isolation that comes with it because you're not interacting with the physical world. You're just scrolling by yourself on the phone. So I think that, you know, in my mind, that still prevails. Like we know these algorithms are highly addictive. Adults see it. I see it in my own life if I'm scrolling on social media. That has just got to be a major contributor to anxiety and depression.
Yeah, that being said, I've seen this total shift in my pediatric practice based on these landmark cases, based on what parents are seeing. And it is almost universal that when I'm doing a preteen teen visit and advising holding off on social media until 16, no one argues anymore. Like even the kids aren't pushing it. Like it is now becoming very quickly a societal norm to not let your kids on that anymore. So.
Yes, I love this. And, you know, I'll go back to Jonathan Haidt's book because he proposed in that 4 new norms. I do feel like I've seen the shift, and the 4 new norms he proposed were no smartphone to be given before high school, no social media before age 16, phone-free schools, and far more unsupervised play and independence in the real world. So, you know, while these two different authors kind of have different opinions on whether social media is the chicken or the egg in this like debate about what's causing anxiety and depression, they both would agree on these principles, particularly number 4. Like we need to be letting our kids go, you know, unsupervised, explore and play in the world. And this comes up in my parenting a fair amount, especially with my 15-year-old son who will ask like, hey, can me and my friends with a headlamp go bike to the local corner store and pick up ice cream at 11 o'clock at night, which is like a mile and a half from our house? And I'm like, oh my gosh, no, that's a terrible idea. And my husband's like, you need to let them take risks. When are they going to do it? Okay, yes, this is better than trying heroin. Go take a risk.
No, totally. And I think that's the parenting dilemma, the whole protection aspect that we talked about earlier in this episode. You want to protect them. You want to mitigate risk. But, you know, at the same time, are you actually stifling their ability to explore their world? You know, that's a balance that we need to strike here.
Yeah, it's tough. It's a tough time to be a parent. That's the whole point of why we're doing this podcast. Yeah. We're in the trenches too, trying to figure it out.
Frankly, as a pediatrician, I'm very glad to see that.
I am too. And, you know, I did admit my bias. It's hard for me to feel sympathy for Meta, and I am happy to see that this is going to the level of court cases and getting so much attention. So
this has been an exciting discussion about the hot topics in pediatrics, and I look forward to our next recap where we can kind of recount what's going on in the news in pediatrics again.
This is 10 Kids, 2 Docs. I'm Dr. Vivian Carlin.
And I'm Dr. Sylvia Bank. Stay tuned in the future for more episodes on specific pediatric parenting topics. See you next time.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening to 10 Kids, 2 Docs, hosted and created by Sylvia Bank and Vivian Carlin. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and recommend our podcast to other listeners. Visit our website at 10kids2docs.com, where you can find links to social media and leave comments or suggestions. Back next week with more topics in parenting.